streaming will be. Right, yeah. Except they've got like a crew of 10 in the next room just waiting. Are we good? All right, folks, we're going to get started here. If you are looking for the top 5 errors most commonly found in a developmental edit, you're in the right room. If you want something else, go find a different room. My name's Joe Nassise, and I'm kind of curious because this presentation is adjunct to my presentation this morning. How many people were in that earlier presentation? Okay, a fair number were not. So for those of you who were, a couple things might get repeated. That's good. It'll pound it into your skulls a little easier. For the rest of you, welcome. Why should you listen to me? Who am I? That kind of thing. My name's Joe Nassise. I'm a New York Times, USA Today, Der Spiegel bestselling author of urban fantasy. I've been writing for 21 years now. I sold my first book. I wrote my first book on a dare in college to win a case of beer from my roommate. I wrote that book longhand, sitting in a little security shack on the Fordham University campus. Then it went into a shoebox for 11 years. And my wife eventually found it when we moved into a new home. Asked if she could read it. I said yes. She read it, convinced me to type it up. We submitted it, and Simon & Schuster bought it, and that kicked off my career. So now I'm 31 traditionally published books, another 20 some odd independently published. But I've also been a freelance editor for the last 15 years. And so that's kind of the focus for today. I write urban fantasy. My specialty for editing has been urban fantasy. But I've worked with a fair number of people. Some are actually here. Larry Correa, Jonathan Mayberry, they were both in my last 2 anthologies for Tor and for Gallery, Urban Allies and Urban Enemies. But I've worked with people like Clive Barker, Charlene Harris, Faith Hunter, Sean Ann McGuire, Chris Golden, Jim Butcher, Carrie Vaughn. I mean, if they're a name in urban fantasy, I've probably worked with them at some point or another in the last 15 years, which has been a hell of a lot of fun. There's nothing better than doing the things you love. So we're going to talk about some of the things that I've learned looking literally at thousands of stories over the last 15 years. Does anyone in the room not know the difference between a line and content edit and a developmental edit? Don't be shy. All right. Just so we're all on the same page. What is a developmental edit? Well, a developmental edit specifically looks at the way a story is put together, its structure, its plot, and yes, those are 2 different things. The story's goals, the themes, the characterization, the pacing. What it doesn't do is look at the words you use to tell that story. So one is kind of the 30,000-foot level. The other one is kind of the 3-foot level. We're not looking at the 3-foot level today. We're not going to be talking about grammar and spelling or anything like that. We're talking the 30,000-foot level. What did you do to put this story together? Now, in my freelance editing business, I look at manuscripts 2 different ways. The first is people send me the full manuscript, and I read it cover to cover, and I write them a report based on all of these topics that we just mentioned fall under the purview of a developmental edit. The other way is I look at a single synopsis that tells me how you've structured the story, and I tear that apart in the same manner. Either way, what you're looking at is what did the writer do to present this story to the reader. I talked a lot this morning about how our goal as storytellers is to create an emotional connection, to take our reader on an emotional journey. So I won't get into that as much, but that does kind of hint on some of the things that we're going to talk about. So keep that in mind. And Kate Pickford said that in her session earlier today as well. Emotion is the name of the game. We're trying to take them on a journey with us, and if we're not reaching them emotionally, then all the hard work we do just kind of falls apart. So that's kind of the baseline that we're going to talk about. So a developmental edit looks at all that. A good developmental editor not only tells you where you might have gone wrong, but they make suggestions on how to fix those things. It does you absolutely no good to tell you, hey, your pacing's off. Or your story structure really isn't putting this together so that the reader emotionally connects with your hero. Giving you that much is a waste of time. It just tells you where you failed. And who wants to be told where you failed, right? We want to know, all right, if that's the case, how do I fix it? So we're going to talk about some of that in this session as well. I see mainly 5 major issues. But 99% of the problems I encounter are structural in nature. Simply put, the writer is telling the story in a way that doesn't connect with the reader. And man, there are an awful lot of ways you can screw that up. We're going to talk about the 5 major ones, but there are smaller, isolated issues that can crop up as well. If you get these 5 major problems correct, most of your readers will buy your next book. It's that simple. If it's a good story, if it's an interesting story, they'll stick with you. If you get any of the 5 wrong, it's like I said earlier today, you just sawed off the leg of a stool and you fall off the stool and end up on your ass. They are that important. These 5 are absolutely critical. Everybody with me? All right, let's talk about them. Is that squeaking because I'm walking in front of... Okay. Oh, it's the door. All right, I thought I was doing something with the microphone. Problem number 1, lack of a story goal. So books are about people, right? More specifically, books are about people who do things. They're trying to accomplish something. And what they are trying to accomplish is usually dependent on the genre of the story you're trying to tell. So if I'm writing a murder mystery, the story goal for my hero is probably to figure out who did the crime, right? If I'm writing a romance, the story goal for my hero is to find their soulmate and end up in a happily ever after, or at least a happy for now. If I'm writing a horror story, usually there's something out in the dark that's hungry and has teeth, and we got to get rid of that. If I'm writing a thriller, there's some catastrophic problem that I have to prevent. All those things are dependent on the genre. But regardless of genre, every story has to have a goal. There has to be something your hero is striving toward. And you might think that that is just blatantly obvious, but it's not. I mean, based on the manuscripts that have crossed my desk in the last 15 years, that's the number 1 problem people get wrong. They don't understand the point of the story they're trying to tell. And if I talk to someone and they tell me, hey, I've been writing this book, I'm like halfway through it, and I've just kind of petered out, I'm not sure where to go with it, the very first thing I ask is, well, what's your story goal? What's your hero trying to accomplish? And usually I get this long dissertation about all the plot points that happen in the story, and they meet this person, and they fight that person, and they fall off a building, and get run over by a train, and all this stuff is absolutely irrelevant to the story goal, because they're the plot points rather than the point of the story. And that's a key differential. Without your hero having a goal, there's really no point to your story. That goal is what I call a story engine. It's driving your story forward. It's the very reason your hero is trying to do things. And I should say, I'll use hero and villain a lot. Names don't matter. Terminology really doesn't matter. You can call it an antagonist and a protagonist. You can call it the hero and the opposition. Like I said, terminology doesn't matter. It's just the opposite sides of the problem. The goal your hero is trying to achieve is directly related to the conflict that they encounter within the story. And we're going to talk about that a little more because that's our second problem that is most often encountered. No direct conflict. So let's get some examples of story goals. Frodo, Lord of the Rings. What's Frodo's goal? Anybody, shout it out. Get rid of the ring, right? Destroy the ring. Okay? How about Sheriff Brody from Jaws? Kill the shark. Paul Atreides from Dune. Yes, but he doesn't drive after that point. He's more trying to avenge the death of his father, Duke Leto. Or make the emperor pay for what he's done to House Atreides. So not as easily obvious, but hey, that's a particularly dense book, so there's probably a lot of ways to look at it. Another one, The Hunger Games. Katniss Everdeen, what's her goal? Survive, right? Live. Make it through the games. So pretty obvious. But if you think about those stories, all of the action that happens within the context of those stories are all directly related to the goals they're trying to achieve. Everything Katniss does is to try to make it through. Everything Frodo does is to try to make it to the Mount of Doom and throw the ring in, right? All right. Goal number 1, no defined story goal. Sorry, problem number 1, no defined story goal. Let's move on to the other half of that. Problem number 2, no direct opposition to your hero who is trying to achieve that story goal. This is the other big one I see all the time. You'll have a hero, they're doing something. You'll have a villain, they're doing something else. And never the twain shall meet. They're like two trains going in opposite directions but on different tracks. And that makes no sense whatsoever, because that means you have no conflict. And conflict is the lifeblood of your story. Without it, all you've got is a vignette, a slice of life. You need conflict to drive the tension that goes along with your story goal. I talked this morning about the three-legged stool of storytelling: characters, conflict, and consequences, or stakes. Every single story has to have those three things, or it's not really a story, quite frankly. And without them, you get no emotional connection between your reader and your hero, which makes it a worthless story if it is a story, in fact. So this goes to that. Your villain's goal has to be important to your villain in the same way your hero's goal is important to your hero. So if my villain is just there to be the foil for my hero, he just shows up at opportune times to cause a problem for my hero, I don't really have conflict. They're just kind of standing in and causing problems. That's a cardboard cutout. That's not a villain that people can love to hate. All right? So you need that goal that the villain is trying to achieve. And the villain is trying to achieve that goal with everything they've got. Everything in their power, they're trying to reach their own goal. The problem comes about because the hero's goal and the villain's goal are diametrically opposed to each other. If your hero wins, what happens to your villain? They lose, right? Hero wins, the villain's got to fail. If they're diametrically opposed goals, there's no other way around it. If your villain wins, which is equally as possible, your hero has to fail. Period. No ifs, ands, or buts about it, because their goals are opposed to each other. Everybody with me on that one? That one's key. All right, so what I'll see often is either a villain who isn't working to achieve their goal or a villain who has no goal. And both of those are equally problematic. What I suggest to my clients often when they tell me they're stuck, they're not really sure where they're going, whatever, I'll give them just a couple questions to answer. What's your hero's goal? Tell me in a sentence or two. What's your villain's goal? Tell me in a sentence or two. And then we get to that third leg of the puzzle. Well, what happens if they don't achieve that goal? Those are the stakes of your story. Went the wrong way, sorry. There we go. Stakes are the difficulties that arise if your hero does not achieve the story goal that they're striving for. So I'm writing an action thriller and the villain has grabbed a crate of bubonic plague and my hero has to stop him before he releases it. The problem that the stakes that my hero now has is, well, I got to prevent everybody from getting infected with bubonic plague, right? That's equally as important as, well, I've got a teenager who, is being bullied at school, and if they don't resolve the situation, well, that can result in physical harm or suicide or what have you. The stakes can be global or they can be personal. How you choose that is dependent on the type of story that you're telling. And we go back to genre for that, you know? If you look at a thriller, if you look at science fiction, those stakes tend to, and action-adventure, those stakes tend to be more global in nature. They're larger, less personal stakes. If you look at things like young adult coming-of-age stories or mysteries or romances, those stakes are very personal in nature. They impact that individual rather than everybody on the planet. If you take, use our example from earlier, Katniss Everdeen, surviving the Hunger Games was her goal, and that is a very, very personal goal and personal set of stakes, because if she doesn't do it, she's dead. It's the end of it, right? The more your stakes increase, the more your reader gets stressed on behalf of your hero. I said earlier that the important key here is an emotional connection between your hero and your reader. That's what gets your reader to continue reading. And so it's the stakes that kind of drum up that initial emotional connection for the reader. And as those stakes get more problematic, as they get more difficult, as they loom more current, in the window coming up, the reader gets stressed out. And you want your reader stressed. And it's like the only time where stress is a good thing, because that stress keeps the reader reading. At that point, they want to know what happens. They're rooting for your hero, so it's the stress driven by the stakes that keep them pushing forward. Now they can't put the book down because they have to know, does Frodo destroy the ring? Does Katniss survive? Does Sheriff Brody kill the shark, right? So in looking at stakes, take Lord of the Rings. I'm going to use the same examples as I did in the early ones. The stakes for Lord of the Rings is pretty much complete subjugation of all the races. Sauron wins, everybody else loses, right? The stakes in Jaws, well, your life and death of the individual town people that the shark decides to munch on. But the town is also a tourist town, right? And so if the tourists don't show up because the shark is munching on people, well, then the town dies as well. So it's not just individual stakes, it's slightly larger stakes for Jaws. The stakes in Dune are both personal and slightly more global as well. It's not just Paul's family that he's looking to avenge, but it's the complete eradication of the House of Atreides that is looming ahead of him. So again, to keep that future connection, he's pushing to solve his story goal. And finally, the stakes in Hunger Games, we've said it a couple times, it's fighting for our life, right? All right. Those three big ones are the obvious ones. Those are the ones that, I can look at a synopsis and point out in 30 seconds. Oh, you have no story goal. You have no direct conflict. You have no stakes of any worth. And again, that's our three-legged stool. Those are the ones that we want to look for most often. The next one's a little less obvious. There's no agency for your hero. When we say a character has agency, we mean that that character is making decisions and taking action to reach toward their story goal. They are driving the action of your story, okay? If a character doesn't have agency, that means they're being carried along by the plot. It's the difference between being proactive and reactive in terms of trying to solve the story goal. Characters with no agency show up all the time in manuscripts that cross my desk. They're characters that have things happen to them over and over and over again throughout the story, and then they get to the end and somebody else shows up out of the blue and solves the puzzle and saves the day. And that is probably the most frustrating part of being a developmental editor and the most frustrating problem that I uncover, because they tend to get a lot of the other things right, and at the last minute they screw it up. You want your hero to act heroically. That's why we call them heroes, right? They have to be the one making the decisions. They have to be the one driving the story. And when you get to the end, they have to be the ones who do that final action to either win or lose, to either succeed or fail when it comes to the story goal. Think about that for a minute, and somebody tell me, what's the problem with Lord of the Rings? Say again? The answer was Frodo's a wimp. He just kind of goes along. Stuff happens to Frodo all the time. But Frodo isn't driving the action for the most part. It's one of the reasons why I don't think Frodo's the hero of the Lord of the Rings. I think it's Sam. But there's a problem with Sam as well, because Sam doesn't carry out that last action to destroy the ring either, right? Gollum does. He bites the ring off of Frodo's hand and then falls into the crack of doom, and the ring gets destroyed. Yes, Sam and Frodo brought the ring to that point, so you can say that they carried out most of the action, but the final penultimate moment of that story is in someone else's hands. A little annoying, but hey, he's really successful. I can't complain too much, right? If you look at the Hunger Games, it's Katniss who carries the day. Even her decision not to kill the other, what they call them, tributes, is a decision, yes or no, in terms of reaching her story goal. I'm not going to spoil Dune because, hey, we've got another half of a movie coming, and, a couple of years wait, but I'm sure you can figure out where that story's going as well. Sheriff Brody, he gets rid of the shark, right? And it's Brody himself who carries out the act to kill the shark. All of those characters have agency. All of those characters are taking the actions necessary to reach or fail to reach their story goal. And I should comment on that for a minute. Your story doesn't have to end with your hero reaching their goal. There are stories out there where the hero fails. But in saying that, you still need a conclusion to your story that is satisfying to the reader. And guess what? That's the final major problem I see over and over again, is that there's no conclusion. Frankly, there's no conclusion, never mind a satisfying conclusion. So I mentioned this in my talk earlier. My third book was a book called Eyes to See, and I'm sorry for the spoilers, but I need to make this point. The series is an urban fantasy series where the main character, Jeremiah Hunt, is searching for the daughter that vanished from his home 5 years earlier. Jeremiah is racked with guilt. He does all sorts of crazy things to try to figure out what happens to Elizabeth. The opening line of the book is, "I gave up my eyes in order to see more clearly." He literally gives up his sight to see the supernatural world to try to find what happened to his daughter. And me, in my infinite wisdom, was like, okay, I'm going to write a multi-book series here where I don't tell anybody what happens to Elizabeth until the very end of the series. So each book was going to give a little clue and move the story forward. What's wrong with that idea? There's no conclusion, right? I build up that first book. It's all about finding out what happens to Elizabeth, and you get to the end and you don't find that out. And my editor from Dromer Nauer, Tim Sonder-Huskin, sent me an email that says, "We can't publish this book." I'm like, wait a minute, you just bought a 3-book series from me, a 3-book trilogy based on this story, and now you're telling me you can't publish it. And he says, yeah, you didn't end the story. And I fought him tooth and nail for like a month, emails back and forth, like, no, here's the grand plan. Tim, you just don't understand. And Tim was like, no, Joe, you don't understand. Your readers will never follow you from book 1 to book 2 because you let them down so heavily by not resolving the story goal in book 1. It didn't matter that they weren't satisfied by the conclusion. I didn't even give them a conclusion. I just avoided it entirely. So, since those books are on the shelves these days, clearly I folded and I rewrote the ending, and you do find out what happens to Elizabeth by the end of Eyes to See. However, that discovery then pushes Jeremiah into a new phase of his life. And so that's what pushes the reader into book 2. They've committed to Jeremiah at this point. And frankly, Jeremiah starts out the book as a complete, utter asshole. And that was kind of the point. Can I take a character that everybody thinks is a jerk and redeem him well enough that by the time you get to the end of book 1, you're willing to follow him into book 2, never mind book 3 and book 4, which is currently underway. So the ending has to be conclusive, but it doesn't always have to be a success. Everybody with me on that? All right. So, imagine if you had the Lord of the Rings where Frodo never makes it to Mordor. Kind of pointless, right? You know, a couple thousand pages of pointlessness. What if Brody doesn't kill the shark? Or Katniss doesn't survive the first round of the Hunger Games? Or Paul doesn't, well, we already addressed that. Yeah, you get my point. You have to conclude those stories. Those 5 things: no story goal, no direct conflict, no stakes or consequences, no agency, and a non-existent conclusion are the 5 things that can immediately derail your story. Now, the funny thing is, I don't often see just one of these. I see 3 or 4 of them all in the same manuscript. Because if you think about it, okay, if there's no story goal, well, then there's no conflict to result from that story goal, right? Or if there's no agency, well, then the character isn't doing things to push the story forward, so I probably don't have, a decent structure for the story either, which is kind of the 6th hidden problem that I didn't mention, is poor story structure. You can do all the right things. You can have a story goal. You can have direct opposition. You can have stakes. You can have agency. And if you put those things in the wrong order, without tying the reader to your hero emotionally, you've screwed it up all over again. Even though you had the pieces of the puzzle doesn't look like what's on the box. And that's a problem of its own kind. Okay. How are we doing for time? 1:05? Perfect. Good. I wanted to end with some time for questions because some of these are they're interesting side channels you can go down. So, questions, we're going to put a mic. You guys come up and ask away.
Hi.
Hi.
How do you feel about like a twist changing a protagonist's goal like in the middle of the book?
If there's a reason for that, I'm okay with it. More importantly, if you have foreshadowed that in some way, I'm okay with it. And I think you get twists all the time. Like, take a mystery. You got a heck of a lot of red herrings in your typical mystery, right? What are those? They're just twists. They're just ways that the hero was wrong and now has to rethink things in order to be able to go down the right path. So I don't have a problem with that. When it comes out of nowhere, when it's like a rock dropped from the sky and hits with a really big thud, and the reader's going, huh? Then it becomes more of a problem. Does that make sense? Okay.
Can you talk about antagonistic forces in women's fiction, romance, lighter genre? There are, maybe not a direct person that's the antagonist, but something within the character.
Their problems, their internal conflict, all of those things operate in the exact same way as like a major global thing they have to solve. Because what they're doing is pushing your hero away from reaching their story goal. So, take a romance. I should note I hit the New York Times list with a paranormal romance under a pseudonym. So I have played in that sandbox, but it isn't the sandbox I usually play in. But really that doesn't matter because a story is a story. And the basic underlying structure that we're talking about is the same regardless of genre at that level. You got little tweaks and twerks as you change the genre, but the major things are all the same. And so I'm the female half of a potential couple. I've got a date with the guy I think is going to be my soulmate, and then my kid gets the flu and I can't go on the date. Really simple, really basic, but it happens. And it is one of those antagonistic forces that pushes the hero away from the goal they're trying to achieve. The key is that every time that happens, you want the stakes to get a little higher to generate a little more tension for the hero and, more importantly, for the reader. So, okay, I couldn't do that. But now my guy is going away on a 3-month trip and I'm not going to see him at all unless I figure out a way to rearrange my life in order to steal one date with this guy. Okay, so then I get the date, but now he goes away on his 3-month trip, but I realize he might be the one. So now what am I going to do as the character to try to make that come to fulfillment? I'm not just going to sit back and wait 3 months, am I? What if he meets somebody else in all that time? See, so each little piece is a force that is pushing on the character and trying to move them away from their goal. And each time that happens, the stakes get a little higher, so the hero has to work a little harder. Does that make sense? Okay.
If you have a multi-book series and your concept for the end, the final grand finale is humanity is killed off or the hero saves it.
Yeah.
How do you end each book in the series?
All right, so more nitty-gritty structure question, but it's a good one. So I spoke this morning about structure being kind of 4 phases connected by 3 key moments in your story. First part of your story is kind of the preparation, the setup phase. It allows the reader to emotionally connect with the hero. It gives you some of the background. It introduces the hero. It introduces the setting. It foreshadows some of the problems to come. And then you hit what most people typically call your inciting incident. I like to call it game-changing moment number 1, because all of a sudden the game for the hero has changed. Something happens. The hero has to take a left turn in their life. They can't go back and fix things. They have to move down this new path. Next 2 phases are both reactive and proactive phases. The first phase is where your hero is reacting to that first game-changing moment, and it's an emotional reaction. They don't know what's happening. They don't know who's behind things. They're just kind of being pushed along by the story. That's why it's reactive. It is a passive section of your story. Game-changing moment number 2 gives your hero a bit more information, so the proactive phase comes along. That's the meat of your story. That's where your hero knows who's behind the problem or knows what they have to do, and so they're striving to achieve that. Game-changing moment number 3 gives them the last piece of the puzzle so that they know what's going to happen, and then they go out and try to win the day, try to do last-minute, all-or-nothing move to save the story. So with that structure is inherent in a single book. You've got 4 acts, 3 game-changing moments. But a really well-planned series takes that structure. I like to think of it, each book is like a rectangle. The story starts here and ends down here. It's going to take that structure and turn it sideways and run it across the entire series. So now you have individual story goals for the individual books, but just the same, you've got a story goal that stretches across the entire series. Take Star Wars, the original trilogy, for instance. The first film was about destroying the Death Star, right? The entire series, however, is about defeating the Empire. And as you move through the individual films, there are moments that push that larger story structure forward through each of the 3 films until you get to the end. Books are the same. In today's publishing climate, not today's publishing climate, go back 10 years, previous publishing climate, I sell, say, 3 books to Tor. I have no guarantee that Tor is going to buy books 4, 5, and 6 that I have planned for this series. And with typical drop-off between book 1 and book 2 being about 50%, there are a heck of a lot of series out there that got cut before the writer, who might have known where they were going with the series, ever had the opportunity to do so. So having existed in that world, we learned to hedge our bets. All right, I'm going to write these books, and I'm going to have enough of a conclusion that if I get cut before I reach 9 books or 12 books or 15 books, at least my readers aren't totally pissed off at me and there's some semblance of an ending. But that isn't the most ideal way to write a series. The ideal way to write the series is plan all the books out, plan the overall story arc that goes through each of those books so you get one tight, complete package. Hopefully that was helpful. Go ahead, man.
What advice do you give an author that hasn't worked with a developmental editor before?
That hasn't?
Hasn't.
The first thing is know what you want out of the process. Editors are like agents. There's no governing body that makes us take a test to show that we have the skills to be editors. And I've had horror story after horror story. You know, I paid thousands of dollars to this editor to fix my book, and they didn't fix it. And then I did it again with a different editor because that editor was cheap. And before you know it, their book is, you know, they've spent gajillions and they haven't solved the problem. So first thing I do is know what you want. Second is know who you're working with. What qualifies them to be an editor? You know, when somebody asks me, who have you worked with in the past, I've got a whole list of people that I can mail out and let them know. From big names to small indie names. My website has multiple comments from people who have worked with me in the past. I'm on Readsy. You can go read the reviews on Readsy of people who have worked with me from Readsy. So they know what they're getting. Having been in this industry both on the writing side and the editing side for more than 2 decades, I think I bring something to the table that a lot of people don't. And yet, there are other editors out there that, you know, are far more experienced than I am. And those are people that I like to work with because I can still learn something from them. So know what you want, know who you're working with, and make sure you do it at the right time. There are 2 times that you can hire a developmental editor that's going to help you save time, energy, and money. The first one is when you've worked up what story you want to tell. That's why I offer that synopsis approval kind of process. I don't want you to have to write the whole book and then come back and rewrite the book if your story doesn't hold weight. So being able to write a synopsis, a 1 or 2 page summary of all the high points in your story, tells you that the story actually works. Of the 31 books I've sold to New York to date, only one of those books was written before I actually sold it. And that's the one I won the case of beer over. All the others were sold off of just a proposal. 2-page synopsis, 3 chapters. I'm able to do that because I understand the structure that an editor is looking for to show the complete story. Not everybody can do that, but it's a really great skill to try to hone. So if you can work with a developmental editor, just understanding the synopsis you've put together, that's a bonus. Because A, it's going to be a lot less expensive. They're only reading 2 pages. And B, it saves you all the rework. The other way is the whole manuscript's done. You're not quite sure if it hangs together. You want a professional opinion about it. Great. Send them the manuscript. They'll read through the whole manuscript. You'll get a lot more detail, or you should get a lot more detail from that because the book is there. You know, the concept has now been played out in reality, and we can know that, yeah, you said you were going to do this, but then you actually did it within the story itself. So those are the things I'd look for when hiring a developmental editor.
Hi.
Hi.
When you're looking at a dual point of view romance, obviously one of the goals is the romance to come together at the end. But each of the main characters also has their own goal in the story.
Yep.
Can you talk about how those goals come together and how you balance them and make
Sure.
sure things hit the right point at the right moment?
Remember that they're both two individual people who are striving for their own goal for reasons that are personal to them. So they both may want to end up as the happily ever couple, but events that play out may keep them from doing just that. They may get skittish for different reasons. There may be outside influence that are pushing them in different directions. I really want to be here, but hey, I'm moving to the UK next month. Do I really want to start a relationship? Things like that that impact the decisions those characters make. Their arc is going to do the same thing it does, in a thriller, in a horror novel. Eventually, they're going to overcome those obstacles and come together, and they're going to reach their goals. What's different about a romance is their goals are the same at the end. It's the relationship. So instead of the hero winning or the villain failing, essentially you've got two heroes, and both of those heroes have to eventually succeed, overcome their own problems, their own conflict that's in front of them, and then come together at the end. How you do that is as varied as the colors in the rainbow. But that's still the process that you want to use to get them there. Does that make sense? Okay.
I hope I'm not overstepping on this first part, but one thing I did when I was hiring a developmental editor was I hired 10 of them on Upwork to do the first chapter and then picked the one that worked the best for me. It's a cheap way to figure out who you want to work with. But my question for you was, you said a drop off between book 1 and 2 is about 50%. What is poor, average, and good on read-through rate for the rest of the series?
All right, so that figure is what traditional publishers have been quoting for the last 2 decades. In traditional publishing, you're only as good as your last book. So, I sell a book. I get paid X amount for that book, to write that book. Then I don't see another dime until I've sold enough copies of that book to earn back what they paid me. It's called earning out. Okay? If I don't earn out on that first book, and here's a little tidbit about the publishing industry, 85% of books do not earn out. It's the big mega sellers that carry everything else. Publishing is the craziest industry on the planet for that reason. It's operating in a 1940s, 1950s mentality that shouldn't operate today. It's one of the reasons why self-publishing arose, because traditional publishing was so nuts. But so in order to do that, I have to earn out, and in order to earn out, I have to get enough people to read book 2. I mean, to want to move on to book 2. They got to get through book 1 to get to book 2. The thing we call read-through is a complete fabrication. The way we calculate it is nonsense. So I don't know who read book 1, so I can't tell you that those readers who went on to read book 2 are the same people. Right? I mean, there's no scientific study in the world that would uphold that way of making numbers. But we don't have any other option. So I know over the last the last 6 years, that's the data I looked at, roughly 93% of people have read through all of the books in my Templar Chronicles. If I can get them to read book 1, 93% of them will go all the way down to book 12. Great read-through. But it's not real read-through. I don't know that those are the same people. So I can't tell you the answer to that question, what's good, what's bad, what's poor, because those numbers aren't real. I can tell you this, you want as many people as possible to continue reading through your series. Whatever that number is the number you have, and striving to keep them reading further and raising that number is a worthwhile goal to try to pursue. But the actual number itself, who knows? We are out of time. Thank you very much for coming. I certainly appreciate it. I am around, so if you have individual questions or whatever, grab me in the hallway, grab me between sessions, and I'm happy to answer as many as I can. Thanks, Jim. You're welcome.